Hello, Digital Void community, and welcome back to the Digital Void Virtual Salon series, where we explore the gap in common understanding of culture, media, and technology. Tonight, we welcome Beacon founder and author of Automating Humanity, Joe Toscano, in conversation with Dr. Jamie Cohen, digital media culture expert and founder of the New Media program at Malloy College. Jamie and Joe will have a discussion for about 30 to 35 minutes before we open the forum to all comments and questions, which you can feel free to leave in the chat. Please make sure to subscribe to stay tuned each and every week as we are live here on YouTube. You can listen to recorded versions of these conversations on Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, and your favorite podcast provider. Jamie, Joe, thanks so much for joining here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you, Joe. I'm really happy to have you here. I'm really excited to talk to you. Your work is like inspiring, and in the work I've done in education is kind of like in that digital media literacy space. And in my space, it's very much like discussion. It's put through pedagogy. It's put through classroom activity, and yours is put through policy. Yours is put through consumer thought and protection. And I really want to know a couple things. First, who are you, and how did you get to be the founder of Beacon? And could you tell us about Beacon?
Yeah, sure. So a little background on me, if you haven't met me before. I'm a former consultant for Google. I was an experienced designer. I started my career as a software engineer, and in college spent some time doing data science. The reason I transferred, a lot of people are like, well, why didn't you stay in data science? Why weren't you an engineer? I didn't stay in data science because I didn't enjoy the day-to-day fully being a researcher all the time. I didn't stay in engineering because as I built out systems, I started to realize pretty soon I'm going to build systems that build the systems, and so I won't have a job. Mm-hmm. And so I moved into design or information architecture at large, and the blending of my skills, having that background, has really helped me be a better designer and think through the systems of what I'm designing from a technical perspective versus just being more of an artist. That being said, while I was at Google, I was helping with a lot of both internal product beta release and development, but also a lot of marketing and taking things to product, said that backwards. A lot of product marketing and taking things to market. So I saw a lot of their practices, and also to keep them on top, we had to realize, what's going on Amazon, what's going on Facebook, learned a lot about the industry, and just holistically didn't believe in the way that the system was treating society. And so I left in 2017. And I've been touring the world really for the last 3 years, giving talks about technology ethics, how we change the system, both from a consumer perspective and from a business perspective. And that's where both my book, Automating Humanity, which is, a little glimpse. It's a book that's really like it's a manual for the general public to pick up and understand what's going on and get involved, because there's so many books out there that are technically brilliant, but inaccessible to the general public. And so I knew, being from Nebraska, I was like, we need something that the middle of the country can pick up, and they don't have to be experts, but they can at least engage politically and not just scream for something that they don't really know how to talk about. So that was part of it. And then second part is, out of the book, I created Beacon. And Beacon stands for the Better Ethics and Consumer Outcomes Network. And as you can hear in the title, it's taking ethics and making them consumer outcomes. And the reason we did this is because we tried pushing legislation. We tried getting into that realm, and it's very hard. We are in that realm. I'll tell you that. I also help with the World Economic Forum and setting national and global level frameworks. I've been in conversations with New York State Senate on different policies for data privacy, including their Data Privacy Act 2020, as well as some stuff around COVID that's coming out in the near future. But what we saw when we were pushing into policy is that's a 3 to 5, maybe 10-year time cycle to get policy in place. Mm-hmm. The best way to make changes, that we believe, is that you find out how to do it on business terms. And so Beacon, we take those ethical dilemmas, translate them into consumer outcomes, and put a dollar value to better business practices, which we then sell back into companies, either through consulting or through product development, which we are just going to be releasing our first white label privacy solution here in a couple weeks. So probably a lot more that we could cover, but that was in the weeds enough. So let's, I guess.
It's a really important process. And I do agree with you that working with policy, legal, and everything is very difficult. It's due to the nature of the political system we have, it's difficult to talk about this, and especially difficult to talk about something that people really have a problem understanding at the very base level. And I think because of the free of a lot of these apps and a lot of the technologies, people forget that like nothing's free, and that if you're not paying for it, you're obviously the product. But that obviousness is obvious to me, but it's not obvious to users because they get some sort of benefit. And I know a lot of your work revolves around making that recognizable. So can you talk about how you bring those ideas to the public? How do you give a metaphor, or do you use anecdotal evidence? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really big question, but great question. And it is one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, especially when it comes to like monopoly behavior. I've sat in conversations with the attorneys generals. It's such a weird way. Why would you just say attorney general? Attorneys generals across the United States, sometimes up to 15 or 20 of them in a room from different states, talking about the antitrust investigation with Google and Amazon and Facebook. The thing I try to bring to them is, if you don't know antitrust law, there's three main pillars to it, which is the price gouging aspect, or the price fixing, whatever you want to call it. There is the restriction of trade or free trade, and then there's the destruction of competition. There's obviously different variables here and there, but those are the main three pillars. And most legislators I talk to, most attorney generals I talk to, can clearly see something's happening in the realm of destruction of competition. A good chunk of them are getting to the point where they're starting to see the restriction of free trade, but that's even really difficult, because when you're talking about trade, it's no longer like the railroads, which physically you can see what's going through the world,
right?
Or
physical material. Yeah,
banking or oil. It is data, and so to wrap their heads around the free exchange of data is hard. But a simple example I tell people is like, for example, sharing on Facebook. When I click the share button on Facebook, there are more options today, like literally today, than there were last year. But still, most of the options are share within Facebook or share within Facebook products, like WhatsApp or Instagram, Messenger, things like that. There's not share to Twitter. There's not like share to Pinterest, stuff like that. And why is that? Well, that is what we call in the digital world a seamless digital ecosystem. It is built for consumer experience purposes, and there's no lying about that. That is the truth. If I click that share button and I got 1,000 different places to share it to, I'd be overwhelmed. It wouldn't really probably be enjoyable. But also, it's restricting the free trade of data across platforms. They intentionally do that to keep the data within their walled garden. So that's a simple example that I bring up and I talk to them about. But the hardest thing for them to wrap their minds around is the price gouging or the price fixing, because like you had mentioned, things are generally free nowadays, and a lot of the more recent antitrust, competition and those kind of questions have relied on the fact that if it's getting cheaper fiscally, that's best for the consumer. And so now that we've hit zero, isn't that just optimal? And that's kind of where I have to really stretch their minds a bit and explain to them that, yes, while the fiscal price is zero, these companies now operate in a different marketplace, right? Which we now know as the attention marketplace. And in this marketplace, they take attention, they turn it into what I believe is a legitimate asset of data. And then they use that data to create new products, to sell or trade, or the label they want to give it, and then make money. And so they're taking an illegitimate asset, they're turning it into a legitimate asset and turning that into cash. And that operation acts a bit like a money laundering scheme, right? And that's what I bring them is like, it's not actually money laundering. I'm not trying to frame that at all. But what they have to realize is that there is a black market going on. They've created this new marketplace that is controlled only by those who are in power and only understood by those inside. And is complexified, saying, don't look at us. We're doing okay. We're doing fine. There's no problems here. Do you know the last time that happened? The financial crisis.
Oh, of course. Like the capacity of the housing market that we couldn't even figure out. Financial literacy.
Yeah, the complexity of the loan programs, all those things. Don't look. It's double, triple A rated, whatever it is. And it's all safe. Don't worry. We're good. It's too complex for you to understand. We've heard these arguments before. And then we saw one of the largest crashes up until the last couple of months. And so what I saw back, 3 years ago, I saw this and I was like, this is not good. Whether it collapses or not, fingers crossed it doesn't. Whether it collapses or not, it's not good behavior. And we need to figure out how to fix it. And so I bring that to them. And then if you bring it back a little bit, though, I abstract it even more beyond that, because I'm not trying to point a crime of money laundering. But let's consider data a legitimate asset and has a value to it. Then we have to consider this. The whole point of gaining attention is to gain more data. So we are paying in data, right? That means while they've lowered the fiscal cost to zero, they are actively and intentionally raising the attentional price or the data as high as possible. So they're now price gouging in this new marketplace they've created. And that's when the legislators go,
yeah, me too. Yeah.
They really thought of it that way.
Yeah.
But that's how they make their money.
Yeah.
And that was it's a pretty simple thing when you really abstract it out, but it's very complex to actually understand if you don't have any conceptualization of what's going on the platform or in the system.
It's also the conceptualization of value itself, because they have to create an idea of what value is in data. So it has to, if it's worth something, and in this case attention, it's converted into currency through the systems. Yep. But if a consumer sees it as a zero cost input, there is a value in their experience or their value in their time, or whatever the value is, has a numerical number. And then it's filtered or laundered through the social media into banks, data banks, so to speak, in the cloud.
Yep.
And then we often forget that like the roots of these terminologies of data means to give, but we're really in a CAPTA situation. It's more of that they're taking, because maybe at the beginning data was the formula where we were just creating. But as time went on, the CAPTA system became this large vacuuming and really precision-based analysis of what value can be placed. How do they know they're doing it right? How do the corporations know they're actually creating the right value? Or are they just trying to take as much as they can?
I would say they don't know at this point, because there isn't a set value to data, right? There's no gasoline is X amount of dollars per gallon in the United States. There's nothing like that for data. I've tried to frame a way that we could value it, and it's really difficult because, first of all, different value is attributed to different people. So there are different data points as well. But I mean, a very baseline way we could conceptualize it is we could figure out how much data is created in general. Then how much data does the average person create per hour, right? And then we could start to frame it from there as based on how much data someone's creating, we could relatively price it at an hourly rate, similar to how we do labor. That's very general. There's a lot of detail in there I'd have to walk through to really get to the detail. We'd have to hygiene it. We'd have to look through and make sure a bunch of different things are happening, that it's not just bots creating data to earn capital, stuff like that. There's a lot of variables in there. So I won't go into super depth on that, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that data, like money, like any other real asset, is simply a physically, I guess data is barely even physical as we conceptualize it, but it is an actualization of our labor.
Right.
I don't know the best way to say that, but something I wrote about in my book and something I talked about at my TEDx is, so for example, Bill Gates thinks we should tax automation, specifically in the form of robots. And that's kind of easy to do because you can see a robot doing work. So you can say this robot worked X amount of hours, produced X amount of capital, and so we can charge it tax just like we would a human.
Right.
The thing is, the large majority of automation happens through software. And where is the labor in software? Right. For one, software is not a physical entity as it is with a robot. It's infinitely scalable. It can work 24/7, no complaints, no nothing. But where is the labor? Well, the labor is in the data we create, right? When we create data, we are teaching that system how to operate effectively. Yeah. And so that is the labor. And so my claim that I brought to some of these legislators is that we should be taxing based on the collection and processing of data, the amounts, similar to how we we price our utilities of water going through our house, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we analyze how much water is crossing through our homes and pay a relative cost to our usage, I believe that companies should have to do the same thing. And this tax, for one, it would then create cloud law. So all these companies that are evading taxes worldwide because they can be anywhere, they're not under any specific jurisdiction, they no longer can do that. This is cloud law. So it's based on how much data you're processing, collecting on your cloud in general.
Right.
Doesn't matter if that's data from the US, from Europe, wherever. Like, for example, we as the US might say, make this law for US citizens. So Google could go process data in Europe, but it's a United States citizens' data. And so they have to pay the tax of the United States, so it comes back to us. That's
right.
one thing. It would give companies a reason to actually find a legitimate revenue model beyond just existing on investment capital. Like, could you imagine, for example, Amazon spent almost 20 years in the red, 15, 20 years. I don't know the exact dates, but something about that, 15, 20 years in the red before they became revenue positive. And it was mostly floating on investor capital.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Could you imagine investors dumping billions of dollars into a company that, on top of running in the red, also has to pay a tax on all that data they were collecting? They would have never broken even on stuff like that, right? And so a lot of these companies, it would change their business model. And finally, we could take that tax or money, it could come back directly to the consumer. I would really love that, but that's an even bigger step that we'd have to discuss. But let's say it's just a general tax. Yeah. That tax could then go back to reskilling labor, reskilling people. Mm-hmm. Similar to back in the day, we used taxes to help build railroads or roads, things like that. We can now retrain workers, both in technology or in sustainability efforts or things that we need as, lack of better words, like nationalized efforts and labor efforts, Right. It could provide really great jobs for people. There's a lot of benefits to it, and I do explain it a lot in the book in more detail, but yeah, it's a lot of things to walk through.
It's a lot to think through, because even just your explanation it's mind-blowing. It's heavy duty. It's also the concept of reverse engineering the data, like kind of knowing, like your analogy, I think, is perfect. When we see machines operating, we interpret that as labor. But you're right, when it's doing the same process, the software can be used 10,000 times, and there's no real way of understanding what the code does at multiple spaces.
Hourly labor, yeah.
Yeah, and the opacity of all this is intentional, in my opinion. I think it's designed because I think, let's go back to your old example of or your former example of the housing crisis. Financial illiteracy is by design so that we can't think of it. One of my big parts of teaching students is teaching them about interest, just to explain how much a student loan costs. And those types of things are to me, a credit issuer should tell you that up front, but obviously they're not going to, because then you just wouldn't do it. And when we use social media or anything, I know this is a big part of your work, but it's so amazing to me when I ask my rhetorical question every class. So you've all read the terms of service, of course, right? Mm-hmm. And no, I mean, none of them have. And I know that a lot of your work too is simplifying that down so it's a lot more accessible. So
yeah,
does the terms of service actually tell us anything, or is it?
At this point in history, we're going to say no as a general statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is a big part of my work now with the World Economic Forum. I'm on their data protection initiative. I'm part of their steering committee. And so, yeah, that's a big thing I work on all the time. And that's also what our product is for. So what we've been working on, we're calling, instead of legally binding contracts, right? That's what a lot of people are looking for. I think we've aced legally binding contracts at this point in history. I think we've perfected them to the point where they are abusive. Mm-hmm. And what we're working on is loyalty binding contracts. So these are contracts that will protect you as a business, but also be reasonable enough that they are accessible to the public and explanatory in a sense that you're still going to have all your protections, but people are actually going to understand what they're engaging in and have access to control them. And so that's a big thing for us, because no, right now it's not accessible. I mean, I'm doing a big study on policies, not just policies, because that's another thing is we get lost in the privacy policy being the way to understand the company. In reality, it's not just the privacy policy. If you really want to know what's going on, you have to read the privacy policy, you have to read the terms of service, you have to read the cookie agreement. And most of them, what people don't really think about is even in them, there's embedded other codes, such as like, if you don't understand this, reference the US EU Privacy Shield. Okay, that's another 100 pages. It's a bunch of legal legislation at federal government level. Like, there's so many things to this. And so, yeah, we're actually focused on, instead of recreating just policies, we're actually focusing on entire privacy centers, so that like a small company could get up and running within an hour with their privacy center set up. And so this is a place where consumers can come and they can access all of those policies in one place if they do want to read them. But then there's other parts of the center that makes simpler explanations and highlights the key facts of things that you might get from each policy. It will state what is prohibited to do on this. It will have FAQs. It will break the policies down in a much simpler way, and also give you direct access points to, download your data, to request changes, and have access to all your legal rights under GDPR, CCPA, which generally isn't happening right now, mostly because of the scale of implementation. Right? We made in the GDPR and the CCPA and some of these other laws coming out. This is something I brought up in New York. Is I fully believe in what they're pushing, the transparency, the granularity of control, the descriptiveness, all these access rights. I believe in them. But the second that they launched the GDPR, the whole internet broke. Let's just be honest. The whole internet broke. And it's going to take us years to build to that standard. And the reason why we're not seeing a lot of fines, although we're seeing fines, don't get me wrong, but like I said, the whole internet broke. So we should be seeing literally millions of fines right now. The reason we're not is because it's impossible for a small handful of legislators to keep up with all of those. And so actually it becomes like learned helplessness for the governments, because they're like, there's so much to do, I don't even know where to start.
Wow.
So, we're just putting ourselves in this strange position. I will tell you, I know I have friends working also in the space. We are working to develop what amounts to a data protection agency for the United States and for other countries. If you read the GDPR, I believe it's chapter 6, like section 51 or 52 area, something like that. It's they have stated the need for what they call ISAs, independent supervisory authorities. Because they knew the government's not going to be able to keep up. They also said that these authorities should be funded at least partially by the government. And this is because we want them to avoid regulatory capture, right? The reason with the financial crisis was you had Moody's, you had some of these stock evaluators, these bond and loan evaluators, whatever, who were paid and existed holistically on the revenue sources of their auditing. So this puts the big companies in a powerful position for what they call regulatory capture, which is simply that because I'm paying you, you better make me happy. And that's what happened. If you have an independent supervisory authority that is at least partially funded by the government, it gives that authority, that department or company, organization, whatever you want to call it, the opportunity to have a little bit more backbone, because they can fall back on subsidized money. And so there's just a lot of it's extremely
complex, and it sounds like it has to work on multiple tiers of protection in order for something to even be moved forward, especially in this current environment. I want to ask you a question about who to you is the most vulnerable to any of these problems? Like, is it children, adults, disability, people with disabilities? Like who has, or all of us, or is it just a broad, we're all vulnerable to being taken advantage of by these types of systems?
I'm gonna cop out and say that all of us.
Okay.
I'm gonna say that right now, to be honest with you. I mean, like every sector, every human being, think about it back in the days of the printing press, or even before the printing press, right? The reason why the church had so much power is because you had to go to the church in order to have things translated for you, essentially, right? They had to read it to you. They were the only ones who could read the scripture. We are at a point where like some of the technocrats in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, the big bubbles, are some of the only data literate citizens in the world, right? It's a very, very small sliver of the population that has this insider knowledge. And we as outside of that bubble, anyone outside of that bubble who is not data literate has to rely on the morality of those people. But unfortunately, we're in the middle of a gold rush that's been going on for 15 years.
Yeah.
So you have to be reliant that robber barons are going to be moral and compassionate, noble people. What we've found through the last 10 to 15 years is that's just not the case. And now we're putting regulation in place to protect people. And we're not putting regulation in place because we want a ton of regulation. We're doing it because there literally needs to be a baseline. Otherwise, we're going to have a bunch of abuses, because we're not going to just, this isn't a 5 or 10 year plan to make people data literate. Like, you're talking decades, if not centuries. Think of how long it took from Gutenberg Press in 1450s to now. We have still almost 10% of the global population that's illiterate.
Yeah.
You know, we can do it much faster now because of the internet and online education and access to those things. Maybe we can achieve it in 100 years. That would be crazy. But you're talking a long time.
Yeah.
So we
need a lot of people.
A lot of people. And so we need some foundational guardrails to protect people. That's my personal belief. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but that's where I sit, you know.
No, I think that's a very cogent and important way to think about it. I always use historical references in that way, because we forget that the Gilded Ages of all time came from the taking advantage of those who didn't have access.
Right.
And today we're living through people forget we're living through the extremely early days of social media. Like, YouTube turned 15 like a month ago. You know, it's not even out of its teens at this point. And it's at this point, I would say there's no real outside to YouTube. Everybody knows that it exists, but nobody knows what or how it operates. They just simply experience it.
Exactly.
And that to me is like something that if you could just, in 1450s, or let's say 1470, not everybody had access to a book at that point. And at this point, over a third of the world's population has access to the internet. So it's like this, the access is huge, but the literacy is probably the same. Like, it's just, we don't know how to operate the machines. We just simply go on them.
Yeah.
So the question I would ask you next is a little about the current situation. We're now digital. Like, we're now in a digital world. For those of us who have the privilege to work from home, and for those of us who have the privilege to have become digital, what does this mean for companies? This is like the ultimate data grab at any moment. Now they're seeing us in our captive state. They didn't really see us in the captive state before. They saw us in their mobile state. So what does that mean now?
Forced paradigm shift. Of course, like, I don't know what else to tell you, but that's part of why I left, to be honest. I mean, I have a whole chapter in the book about, I was predicting like the economy is going to crash. And what's going to happen when the economy crashes is that we have all this automation already built. And so when the economy crashes, we're going to see the markets continue to grow, which, oh, by the way, that's what's happening, because we don't need the humans to do the labor anymore, right? And those humans aren't going to get their jobs back. So what happens when you have large change, who, like McDonald's, for example, has been switching over to kiosks within their store? Well, now just happens to be a great time to roll those out nationwide. And by the way, we don't need as many workers anymore either. You know, you saw even like a year and a half ago, I believe, Verizon cut like 30% of their workforce and said, we're focusing more on innovation and less on managing people. What does that mean? You know, they were preparing. And now that we have this forced paradigm shift, I'm not going to be a conspiracy theorist and try to say it was intentional at all, because this is a global health pandemic. But to tell me that these corporations are not at least a little fiscally excited by the fact that they don't have to be the bad guys to lay off, that it's just like a crisis, I think, you know, you might be a little too nice in your opinion of a corporation.
They're not our friends.
Yeah. And so, but that was a big reason why I left, because to be honest with you, I saw a huge market opportunity back then to go start and help companies prepare for this transition. And I saw it as an opportunity for me, one, to go back. Like, I'm in Nebraska right now. This is my parents' basement. It's my childhood bedroom. I don't necessarily want to live in Nebraska the rest of my life, but these are people I grew up with here. These are people that I've learned from. They're my people. It's my heart, my soul is here in Nebraska. It's how I was raised. And if I can help them, I can create a model that can be taken anywhere in the United States, and help gentrify and leapfrog these rural communities. I saw this both as something that I could morally believe in as I work, because like I said, I left because I didn't believe in morally what I was doing out there. So I saw it as something I morally believed in, and I saw it as a great fiscal opportunity as a businessman.
Yeah.
It's not taking advantage of people. It's helping reskill workers and uptrain people. And I think there's and empowering economies that have been dying for a long time. Like I truly believe that the Trump election was not purely racist, misogynistic, et cetera, et cetera. Now I believe there's a cohort of his voters who are that way. But having gone home after the election, talking to people, one, I went to my mom and I was like, can you believe this? I was just having a conversation with her. And the first thing she said to me, which I hope everyone takes this and like kind of thinks about it a little bit. First thing she said to me is, we feel like everyone who voted for him felt for the last 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's part of democracy. And also part of democracy is helping build communities. We should not be reliant on a president or government officials to be the community builders. We as individuals need to go back into our communities, and we need to not isolate ourselves in big cities and big tech bubbles. We need to extend our hands out, and it's time that we help people move forward, because we have communities full of people who have been getting pushed out due to automation, who are afraid of the future of their jobs, who don't know how to, what to tell their kids to go to school for, or how they're even going to manage their lives. They're losing their stability, and it's time for us to go back and help them. This is not going to maybe make you a billionaire, but I hope that it's satisfactory to your soul. And there's plenty of work out there right now. And
I think
it's a prime opportunity.
I think your point is very cogent. I think your approach and your tact is right there. When I teach civic engagement, or I teach classes, now remember I teach in New York, so it's very different. The Long Island is a very different space than most of the country, or if not everywhere. And I try to consistently remind people, since I teach technology and I teach new media, or I'm a new media scholar, like I'm always thinking about what does it look like outside of any of our specific bubbles.
Yeah.
What I've always remembered, and somebody said this to me, and I don't remember the attribution at this point, but somebody said that a lot of the election was based on, and this is real, is based on anxiety, regardless of what the rhetoric is that's in that. Mm-hmm. And the anxiety I thought of the most was one, this bifurcated United States anxiety, but also this anxiety of sometimes when we're talking about immigration, or sometimes we're talking about immigration things, we're talking about automation. Like it's just a different way of thinking of it. So we're using boogeymen or scapegoating, but really there's an anxiety about work and labor and the idea of technology being it.
Stability.
Yeah. And to me, that was something that hit at the heart of the rural centers, or even just further suburban sectors. Once you go 100 miles away from the ocean or any city, you get to these places where people are concerned. And then anxiety manifests in any way in which, now this is where I feel like the technologies themselves have a say in it. It invests themselves in a way that someone could come in with solutions or ways of interpreting those anxieties differently. Now that's a completely different conversation that maybe the platforms themselves are complicit in those natures of delivering that type of information. But regardless, what that is that the technologies over the course of the last 10 years, and we've brought this up on previous episodes, and one of the reasons why we had you on is because of your approach in this very human-centric way, is to remember that the 2010s was about this era of this gig economy, like this idea of people being part of the data field, being a driver for a company with no boss, being part of an influencer space in which you're presenting yourself, but who are you? Who's your employer? Like who actually provides your income? And like Robert Kinsel always says at YouTube, he's like, well, I look after the YouTubers or the creators. And it's like, but you can't go knock on his door and be like, Robert, I need help. So the 2010s kind of eroded what we thought of as like what labor is. And then when there's a snap or a moment where you can kind of get clarity, that's a big shift. People don't figure out those things until after. It's always a little bit of a reaction, unfortunately, because people aren't thinking it. I know, and that's your job now, is to kind of remind people that's what these are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I think also in, you're spot on. And I think in that we often get lost as people who are in the field. It's all too common for us to say, oh, well, they're just dumb. They don't get it. They didn't see it coming. It's natural selection. I would reframe it. I would say, actually, people are living their lives and they don't have 10, 20, 30 hours a week to be reading the books, keeping up with all the Twitter feeds, all the new frameworks of code coming out, all this stuff, because they have kids that they have to take care of, they have bills they have to pay, they have health insurance, and not everyone has the time or the luxury or the privilege to have had that education. My parents are smart people, but they didn't go to college. They're blue collar workers. They built our family and our lives off of postal salaries. And they built a second business out of that, worked 2 jobs for 20 years of my life. I mean, they're not dumb people. They're really hard workers, and that's what a lot of rural America is. But they just didn't have a need. There was no necessity to pick these things up. And what's been happening is a groundswell underneath of them that's just cutting the rugs out from under them. And then you have these people who, and I'm not talking about my parents specific because they're more liberal than a lot of the people in the area, but you have a lot of people in rural communities who lack broadband access, have very fundamental things lacking from their lives, maybe are even getting their news still from the radio. And so when they hear all these reports of immigrants taking their jobs, and they live in a community that's 90 to 100% white, they don't have any exposure to people outside of their communities, it's very easy to convince them that that is the truth, when as a matter of fact, it is robotics and automation that has been taking jobs for the last decade.
Yep.
It's not going away.
And it's definitely not, because the systems itself can't help. I always use this term when I talk to my students, at scale. I always say it's always about scale. Like whatever those things are, it's not like it's not like one day Zuckerberg walks in and goes, we did it, we reached it. You know, it's always the idea that it's going to scale outward. So I have 2 more questions. First, it kind of builds on the idea of the automated economy and what that is Nick Cernicek wrote this book about platform capitalism, how the platforms themselves are in this never-ending quest to convert everything into some sort of turn the immaterial into some sort of product. And if they're able to quantize that, then they're able to manipulate us in the ways that we haven't yet thought of. And I know that your book talks a lot about reconsidering how we even do advertising. So it comes from the advertising and from the platform side. So both sides seem to be pushing the user further away from knowledge, but also into more participatory experiences simultaneously. And so I was just wondering if you think about like the way of what scale will look like in terms of like, this is post-pandemic, post years from now, like what it looks like in terms of like our agency inside of these spaces when we're being consistently converted into capital.
That's a deep question. And to be honest with you, I haven't spent a ton of time like thinking all the details through on that. But yeah, I mean, I think we're headed into a world where there's a split. When I was, for example, I'll give you a couple points of contention here. When I was out at the World Economic Forum, one of the last presenters at our meetup workshop last October, he's an international diplomat. He walks up and says, "I've been doing diplomacy for 25 years." And he said, "I'm going to put a bet for you all to watch for the next 5 to 10 years. He says, in 10 years, we're going to have 4 internets across the world. We will have the United States, we will have Europe, we will have China, and then we will have a dark web. And that will be how people exist." So I think part of that's going to be a big split. And then I've also considered, I believe that you're going to have a split even within those of those who choose to live in entertainment for the rest of their lives. You know, maybe they love virtual reality. Maybe they don't care about all this. Maybe they would rather live in virtual utopia than deal with the realities of the real world. Sometimes you can't blame them. And then I think we're having a split of a bunch of other people who want to use technology simply as a utility to improve their lives.
Sure. And
to extend themselves as I believe technology should be used. I will be in that camp for sure. And I think there will be I think, to be honest with you, I think that split probably though is a large majority going the entertainment route because it's easier and it requires less critical thinking, and from an endorphin perspective could be a lot more enjoyable. And then you maybe have 20 to 30% go the other way and really use it as utility and that's kind of how I see it coming out. That's a very broad.
No, I think that's a really good. I have thought that many times. I think science fiction writers have thought it. Everyone from Neil Stephenson to Tim Maughan, like these new books that have been coming out, consider there's no such thing in the future of a collapse of an internet, but definitely a fracturing of access. Recently in The Atlantic, Maya McGinnis wrote an article about capitalism's addiction problem. And it was talking about what is the marketplace of it. In other words, what happens when scale does cause a problem where your addiction, or the term you use is seamless interaction or insular use. Like I always think of Instagram when you say that. There's no way to get Instagram out of Instagram. And so you have to like do work to make that happen.
Yeah.
Doesn't that cause a problem for companies? Don't they want to work in a more open space, because aren't they going to be stuck? Like that. This is a truly coming from a point of curiosity.
Can you explain that a little more? What do you mean by stuck?
She explains that the distraction addiction, the fact that we're stuck, time spent, all the calculations keep us inside the platform. How does that work with the free market? Like, don't companies want to compete? You've brought up that monopolies are definitely a big problem, but don't they want to? Isn't the free market the idea of competition, or is that just not a thing to be thinking about?
Let me challenge your thinking on it. I think ideally it is, and for people like you and me, yes. But I personally believe the push for automation and scale is simply a desire for control, and not necessarily authoritarian control. I'm going to go back to the word I said when I was talking about rural communities, but control in the sense of stability.
Right.
I believe inherently in human being, although a lot of us love to travel and do these things, we actually really love stability. And I think that drives a large majority, if not the majority, of our behaviors across our lifetime. And I think automation is simply the idea of stability. It's a dream. It's a pipe dream. If I could have everyone on the world on my platform and everything was automated, and it's Amazon was literally delivering me predictive packages to my door and all this stuff, the business would just pump forever and ever and ever, and it would be nonstop. We'd have quarterly increases all the time, right? Think about why we want to automate systems. It's not because people can't do it. It's because people can't do it as good or as perfect. As perfect. That's the key word, right? Perfect comes back to control, comes back to ultimately a maniacal desire for stability. I think that in the quotation you brought up, the addiction of capitalism and whatnot, I do believe, just like everything else, every psychological disease in life, there's a spectrum, and those who lead the largest organizations often have on the spectrum of sociopathic greed. Maybe we can consider that sociopathic desire for ultimate stability. Right. I'm being very generous there.
Well, that answered my question perfectly. I mean, that's from your expertise. I mean, you're obviously seeing this from a much broader view than where I'm coming from, and I think there's just a lot of competing. People have all the rhetorical comebacks for a lot of this, which is like, well, can't it just stop? Won't it just break? Won't it do this?
I think it will. I think it will break, only because, to be honest, it's not breaking in China, and I don't think it's going to break in China. But they have a different culture, right?
Yeah.
I've said this over and over again as I go give talks. My hope, why I have a shining light of hope in this, is because we are the United States, and while the United States, I believe, is not in the greatest political position that we've been in, we're kind of in a rough spot right now. The United States is a nation that was born out of a bunch of people who got on a boat at one point and said, screw you guys, we're going to either die out in the ocean or we're going to make it to land, and we're going to redo this whole thing. We are a bunch of, people who want to disturb the peace and make our own ways. And so I believe fundamentally that we will find a way out of this, and it may take time. And as we're seeing right now, we're seeing a lot of sacrifices made through lives, through economic disaster, through all these things. I believe what we're watching, though, right now, beyond everything else that's put out there in the news in the more day-to-day sense, I believe for the past 12 years, we've been in a revolution. Mm-hmm. And people are just unaware because it's not history yet.
Right. Right. Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
revolution. And I think we'll come out of it better. But right now it's real rough. Yeah.
People read revolution in retrospect. They don't realize what it means to live we're in it, and I like being in history. Like I'm interested in that. So thank you. Josh has a quick question, then we're going to jump to our audience members.
Cool.
Joe, thank you so much for everything so far. And one thing that came to mind is that through data empowerment and allowing people to own their data and potentially sell their data, how do you make sure in a system like that that it's equitably distributed, that people who suddenly possess their data are not going to feel forced to sell their data just because there are weaker social safety nets, that it doesn't just become almost like a caste system, and that the less privileged are going to be able to the less privileged will have to sell their data, while the more privileged will have a sense of privacy and security.
Yeah, good question. I think that let me start off by saying I don't think we'll ever be able to entirely avoid that categorical difference between levels of financial independence. Not at least not in the United States and capitalist systems. But I think there are ways to put controls on it and to try to make things more equitable. But yeah, I mean, even think of day to day, like what's happening right now with the coronavirus and the skew in deaths towards people of color. That's often we're seeing a lot because they are in the lower paying jobs and they're forced to go work in the factories or at the grocery store or all these different things because they have the inequities in society. Go even one step further beyond that, even before the coronavirus, like think of the waiter system here in the United States. Like in other countries, waiters get paid a wage. But also there's the balance of service, right? In the United States, we run it the way we do because we want that service. That's an American economy thing. It's abusive in many ways, almost slave in some ways, based on how little they get paid unless they work. And I'm not saying I'm in support of that. I just think it's going to be a very big hurdle to get over it. And I think it really comes down to having appropriate representation on the people writing these bills and helping implement law. We are seeing changes. Now, is it quite the level we need yet? I would say no. But for example, like some of the policy that we've been doing in New York, we've been very intentional in the fact that we bring in representation from all different parts of society to act and help write some of this stuff. That just takes intentional action. It's very hard, but again, it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of effort. And I think for the people who care about that, the best thing you can do is continue to be politically active. Because if you lull asleep or if you believe that it's just going to get taken care of, that's when Trump happens. You know what I'm saying? Like we have to maintain activity, and we have to educate people, and we have to keep guard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. So let's see. Pop up a question. All Tech is Human asks, how can we get a better understanding of what would be considered human-centered, given the vast spectrum of values? In other words, with a human-first strategy, what humans are we thinking of?
That's a good question. I guess there's not a really back and forth question there, but how can we get a better understanding of what would be considered human-centered, given the vast spectrum? This is something I debate all the time. I have to interact with all the time, right? I guess maybe me explaining my process and how I got to where I am would help a little bit on how. I don't know that I have like set principles of exactly all of those things and how do we do it. I think there's a lot of people developing those principles and frameworks. But again, that's part of us building this right now, and it's going to be us building it for years, decades to come. But I will say in the diversity of life, we'll go there first. When I first started out with this, I was working at Google, and Google's a global company. You instantly start to think how you do things and implement them and scale them out globally. So my first thought when I got into all this work was, I want to make a global company. Well, I traveled the world for 2.5 years, 6 to 8 months out of the year. And I realized, wow, I need to focus on the United States first.
Yeah.
Because there is such a diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not just talking in skin color, right? Or like some of the superficial things. I'm talking in cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking in food. I'm talking in like literally the way people, the metaphysical experience of the world.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I have no right going into some of these other nations trying to explain why this should be put together in this way, because I don't know their lifestyles. I don't know their governments, how it's all implemented. Anyway, fast forward a little bit, I started to focus on the United States. I toured a lot throughout the United States. And even here, I think it's outstanding how much diversity we have in the United States. It's unbelievable to me, having given all the talks I've given throughout the world, that we have the United States, period, point blank, period.
I agree. I see that all the time.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And to get people so well aligned, like, it is very difficult. So how do we make it human-centered? I'm going to give you a real generic answer, but I believe it is simply having equity at the table. It is getting the right people in the room. Something I've read about in my book is that none of these systems should be developed out without representation. And one thing I came to, a line that I put in the book and that I've been pushing, is that there should be no implementation without representation, the same way that we fought for no taxation without representation back in the early days of our nation. And so that's a simple phrase I'll give you to walk away with, but that includes not just skin color, but lifestyles, technical abilities, a bunch of different things, a bunch of different variables. And you're never going to have the perfect group of people that is optimally representative. The whole thing is we have to create systems that are built to have checks and balances, that are built to constantly be in beta, right? Because whenever we hit the point where we say, hey, we've built that group, that working group, we're done. We got them put together. We're assembled. At that point, you've lost.
Mm-hmm.
Because things change all the time. Life changes all the time. We have to constantly be checking and see, like, is that board of directors as good this year as we were last year? Are there new positions we need to fill? Are there things that have changed? Your company is going to change. Your population that you're serving is going to change. It's a constant change in the system. And I think the optimum point is that, one, like I said, we have proper representation, and two, we're constantly checking in to make sure that representation is appropriate. And that's about as
that's great.
defined as I can give you.
Leon asks, the lives of America's youth millennials is online. Between Facebook, Insta, YouTube, gaming, etc., their whole lives are collected. Why should they care what they do and how do we get them the message? So I guess the question is, why should they care? Like that is actually a good question I ask my students. Why do they care?
About, I guess we're asking about
concept. Like, students use this like nonchalantly, or young people use it nonchalantly. Like, how do you get the care? The care is a big
Yeah, I guess I'm asking, what are we caring about here? And maybe that's a whole nother question there, and I'll try to answer it my own frame. But are we caring about the privacy? Are we caring about manipulative design practices? Are we caring about ad targeting, micro targeting, stuff like that? And maybe you want an answer to all of them. I will say I started off with that mindset when I was doing it, and as I got deeper and deeper into this, I realized that all of those things and the whole umbrella of tech ethics, each subject is becoming and will be in the future its own industry. That's how deep some of this stuff is. So to actually define what is caring, what are we caring about? I'm going to approach it from the privacy perspective because that's me. So I'll just answer that perspective right now. But I think from privacy, we have to. It's like trying to get people to care about mountain lions stalking you, right? Like, you don't actually care about a mountain lion stalking you until it comes and eats your head off. And that's unfortunately the system of the internet. I think it's going to be a long time before we have that well ingrained into people's minds, the importance of privacy. But what it comes down to is privacy is what enables freedom. Privacy is what allows us to be weirdos without having to be embarrassed. It's what allows us to have dissenting opinions without any pushback, without any like going to jail, stuff like that, right? And people say, well, I don't have anything to hide. I have no problems. You're telling me you've never told a white lie in your entire life? You're lying right now, okay? And so privacy is really important, and there are a lot of points to it beyond just advertising. As I talked about, earlier, data is an asset, and ultimately what privacy comes down is those privacy settings, that privacy policy, when you click consent, that is the, if you will, the intake valve, the spigot at which point your data can be input and used. And I think privacy is highly important because, one, it's enabling our freedom. Two, you're working for a company, so you should be paid. I think that's a big way to get to them, is you should be paid for this work. I believe it's the future of blue collar labor. And two, it's just what's right. It's point blank, it's what's right. I believe there's a moral obligation. And yes, society's lost a bit of its morality over the last 50 to 100 years as we've gotten more scientific than ever before. But I think there's a moral responsibility as well.
I think let me see if we want to go to another one. Let's go to, actually, that was phenomenal as a question. I think I would rather like wrap it up from that. And I actually want to talk to you about your most recent project. I really liked your answer with that one. That hits to me the baseline of like where education comes from. Like I traveled the country too. I did it in a different way. I did it with reality television as a producer. And when I saw the United States, I saw it as, it's amazing. Like it's just how diverse and how wildly strange it is to be a United States.
Yeah.
And when you get that concept of it, you get like a different sense of it. And then I think to go to Leon's question about why they care is like when you deal with students or young people in K-12, because there's no real framework of how you get to learn these systems, it is like a lot of what you just said is like, what do we explain as how do you translate that to something that's important to understand inside these systems? And I like what you said is like, privacy to me is the baseline of like what gives us our rights, what allows us to be us, what gives us agency, that type of space. And so that's the type of thing where we have to do a lot of translation work in education to kind of bring that to young people who have unfortunately like they haven't been guided. They're either by parents or through the systems, and they're just there. We're just in these spaces. So thank you for your work. I just want to bring up one last thing. Could you tell me about the new project? Can you talk about the social dilemma?
Yeah, actually, I was going to tag it onto your comment there. I was thinking of it as you're talking. And I think additionally to that last question, how do we get kids to care? So I'm in a movie called The Social Dilemma that just literally over the weekend got acquired by Netflix and will be coming out. It's featuring, Tristan Harris, Kathy O'Neill, Roger McNamee, Rashida Richardson, a bunch of big names. And we've created this movie to help people understand this. It's not just a technical thing. It's actually like a docudrama. So there's like part of a movie. It's a narrative to it. It's not just a documentary. And I hope that helps. But what I was going to mention about it, and the kids especially, is it was in Sundance, and we went and presented in Sundance, and each of the crowds we had was between 500 and 600 people, something like that. And then we had a screening for high schoolers. We filled out over 1,100 high schoolers in a bi-level auditorium. And it was, I guess maybe like the most emotional crowd I've ever been involved in. We screened the movie everywhere. And by the end, so there's like the movie at the end of it, I'm not gonna give the whole thing away, but at the end of it, it cuts. And when we were filming or screening to adults, when it cuts, everyone clapped. And then instead of credits, well, there's credits, but instead of like the long form bloopers and stuff like that, it actually goes into like things you can do and extra highlights that we didn't put in the film. And it was not until after that the kids started clapping. So for us, as the people that were in the movie, we're sitting there and it was silent. Everyone else was like loud out of their minds for the film. And then these kids were just silent. And we were like, oh, they hated it. It was terrible. Kids are never going to pick it up. And then afterwards, we had questions and answers with them. And these kids were screaming at us about why we need to keep doing what we're doing because their parents never paid attention to them growing up, or because they can't connect with friends anymore, or because companies need to have a moral responsibility to protect us. So while the question is correct, why should kids care? I would argue, actually, kids already do care. And they know more about, they don't know the technicalities of it, but they know the sentimental value of what's going on. They don't know why it's happening. And I hope that this film opens their mind to say, it's not your fault. And we need to make change.
Awesome. Thank you. When does The Social Dilemma, when will we be able to see it?
That one, you have to follow up because I don't even find out until 2 weeks from now. We're having a meeting with the whole team and kind of figuring out the rollout strategy through COVID. But you can go to thesocialdilemma.com and sign on to our newsletter, and you'll get all the updates on what's going on.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you for this amazing conversation. You blew my mind like 5 or 6 times. It's like nuts talking to you. Like hearing your explanations of this is like so overwhelming, I guess the way to put it, but overwhelming in a good way. So thank you so much for your time, and good luck, and stay healthy through all this. And we'll continue to promote and plug and talk about you as much as we possibly can. And
thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. And hopefully this was helpful for everyone. So I enjoyed it a lot, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Thanks again.